The Spinster of Waverly Court. Chapter 1. The Letter from a Stranger. By 8 and 20, Miss Margaret Elmsley had earned a title she had never sought, the Spinster of Waverly Court. No one had announced it formally. It settled over her in small, thoughtless remarks. Poor Miss Elmsley, a comfort to her father. Some ladies are simply meant for a quieter life. Waverly Court, a modest house of warm stone and unruly roses, was her kingdom. There she arranged church flowers, walked the lanes in all weathers, and read novels after her father had retired early to his accounts. Once, her future had seemed very different. At 2 and 20, she had been engaged to Edward Elmsley of Ashwell Park, handsome, charming, and universally approved. Before plans could fully blossom, fever had taken him in a week. His parents had gone abroad to console themselves. His younger brother Thomas was recalled from the war. Letters of condolence had trickled between Ashwell and Waverly, then dried up. The engagement was never spoken of openly, only folded away with other village tragedies. 6 years later, on a damp April afternoon, the post arrived at Waverly Court. A business letter for her father, 2 circulars, and 1 envelope addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand. Miss M. Elmsley, Waverly Court, near Ashwell. Curiosity prickled. Alone in the drawing room, she broke the seal. Waverly Court, near Ashwell. April 10th. My dear Miss Elmsley, you will, I fear, find it impertinent to receive a letter from an unknown hand. I ask only that you read this first page before consigning it to the fire. I have observed at a distance the quiet way in which you move through a world that has not been kind. I know the village calls you spinster, as if your story were finished. I do not believe it is. If you will indulge a stranger, I should like to continue this correspondence under the veil of mutual anonymity. I sign myself, your obedient servant, a friend. Margaret set the letter down, heart beating hard. This was improper. Anonymous letters to unmarried ladies belonged in the cautionary tales of circulating library novels. Yet something in the tone, not flattering, not foolish, but oddly respectful, stirred a part of her that had been quiet for a long time. A friend, she murmured. She knew she ought to ignore it, but the next time she passed the escritoire, she sat down almost without thinking, dipped her pen and replied, Waverly Court, April 11th. Sir, since you have presumed to write to me without introduction, I must presume upon your patience in my reply. I am both amused and suspicious, amused that anyone should find my quiet life interesting, suspicious that a stranger should claim to have watched it. I hope at least you have not judged me on mornings when my bonnet is crooked and my hem muddied. You are correct in one thing. The world speaks unjustly of those who do not follow its usual path. As for the word spinster, I have decided that if it must be mine, I will wear it as neatly as any other label. If we are to continue, you must have a name, however false. Sir makes you sound like a footman. I sign myself yours in cautious curiosity, M. She sealed it before she could lose her nerve, and instructed the maid, if a boy calls asking whether there is an answer for a friend, give him this. No one else need know. The maid nodded, used to Waverly discretion. As the letter left the house, Margaret felt something inside her stir, like a window that had been shut for years, suddenly opened to let in air. Chapter 2. The soldier behind the initial. Mr. Thomas Elmsley had never meant to become a friend. As the younger son of Ashwell Park, he had gone to war years ago, restless and eager. Battle had burned much of that restlessness into a steady, contained gravity. He returned with scars, some visible, most not, and the knowledge that his elder brother, Edward, was dead, and the family estate now depended on him. He also returned to whispers of poor Miss Elmsley of Waverly Court, left behind with only a memory and a broken engagement. He saw Margaret again for the first time on a cold March afternoon. She walked alone along the muddy lane, cloak pulled tight, bonnet ribbons whipping in the wind. There was something determined in the set of her shoulders, something that made guilt and reluctant admiration tighten his chest. Later, in the village, he sheltered from rain near the circulating library and saw an errand boy come out, nearly colliding with him. A folded paper slipped to the ground. Thomas stooped to hand it back and glimpsed the name, Miss M. Elmsley. The boy babbled an explanation. He sometimes carried letters to and from Waverly Court for a man who paid him a few coins. Anonymous letters delivered in secret. The idea that some careless unknown might toy with Margaret's reputation angered Thomas more than he cared to admit. She had already been robbed by fate. She should not be prey to someone's amusement. That evening, instead of composing a stern warning, he found himself writing something very different. My dear Miss Elmsley, you do not know me, and perhaps that is safest. I write because the quiet in which your life appears to be wrapped has been on my mind. The village thinks your story finished. I cannot agree. Forgive the impertinence of a stranger. A friend. He signed it, a friend, because Thomas Elmsley carried too much history. Her past engagement to Edward, his own guilt, their family's shared grief. Anonymous letters were improper. Letters from her late fiancé's brother might be unbearable. When her reply came, sharp, amused, cautious, and signed simply M, he read it several times in a single evening. Her wit surprised him. Her honesty moved him. It had been years since any words, written or spoken, had reached so far inside. He replied, My dear M, you ask why I have written, in part because the village has not been fair to you, in part because I have seen in my travels many people declared finished before their time. I have developed a resentment against that verdict, but mostly I wrote because I have been lonely in a crowd for quite some time and suspect you may understand. Yours, if you will allow it, A. So began their secret correspondence. Spring came. Their letters crossed several times a week, carried by the same trusted errand boy. They spoke of books and sermons, of the absurdities of village gossip, of grief and duty, and feeling slightly out of place in their own lives. The anonymity allowed them to be candid. Sometimes, M, I feel as if I returned from war to a life that moved on without me. I am grateful, and yet I stand at its edge, like a guest at a ball who cannot quite join the dance. A. Then we are both standing at the edge. A. Only my war was quieter, and my wounds less visible. M. All the while, Thomas saw her in real life, at church, in the lane, once at a small dinner at Ashwell. She sat across from him, composed and polite, her grey eyes thoughtful. She had no idea that the man who passed the teapot was the same one to whom she wrote of her private fears late at night. At that dinner, she remarked mildly that she did not keep accounts in friendship. Thomas answered, without thinking, On the contrary, Miss Elmsley, I suspect you know very well what things are worth. You simply refuse to measure them in shillings. Her eyes flashed with quick surprise. The exchange felt so like their letters that his heart stuttered. He knew then that he was in danger. He was no longer simply protecting her from an imagined scoundrel. He was the man in the shadows. And he wanted more of her. More letters, more smiles, more of the way she looked when she was about to argue. But to reveal himself would risk her reputation, and perhaps her regard. To remain hidden was its own form of deceit. He continued selfishly to write. Chapter 3. Shadows discovered. The letters grew deeper. Margaret wrote one evening, I visited neighbours long estranged by sorrow. It reminded me that grief is not a private country. There is a gentleman there whose presence unsettles me, not by any fault of his, but because he stands at a doorway in my past I cannot yet close. Sometimes I wonder, had we met as strangers, would we have been friends? M. Reading those lines in the quiet Ashwell library, Thomas knew with painful certainty that she meant him. He answered more carefully than ever. There is a lady I once knew only from a distance. Circumstance placed a ghost between us. Had we met as strangers, I think she might have been the first person in years with whom I could speak honestly. Life, unfortunately, rarely allows us to start our stories at the beginning. A. Margaret's suspicions sharpened. She found herself watching Thomas Elmsley more closely. The way he listened, the weariness in his eyes when war was mentioned, the kindness he showed village children who dropped their hymn books. The resemblance between his spoken thoughts and the ones in A's letters became harder and harder to ignore. It was terrifying. If A really were Thomas, then their sweet, secret exchange was no innocent game. It was tangled with her past, with Edward's memory, with everything the village liked to whisper when she walked by. The fragile balance collapsed on a brisk afternoon when her father found one of A's letters on the hall table, accidentally left there by a flustered maid. "My dear," he said softly, holding the folded sheet, "I saw only enough to know that this is not a recipe from Mrs. Pritchard. You have been corresponding with someone." Margaret's cheeks flamed. She could have lied. Instead, she answered, "Yes, Papa." "With a gentleman?" "Yes." "Do you know who he is?" "I believe I do," she whispered. He removed his spectacles, looking at her with more gravity than she had seen since Edward's death. "Margaret, I trust your judgment more than anyone's. Still, the world is not kind. Anonymous letters to unmarried ladies, if such a thing became known." "I know," she said quietly. "I know too well." "I will not demand his name," he said, "but I must insist on one of two things. Either you end the correspondence at once, or he declares himself properly. I will not have you whispered about, my love. You deserve better." After he left the room, she pressed A's latest letter to her chest. Then she sat down to write. "My dear A. Our shadows have been discovered. My father has learned of our correspondence. He is gentle, but afraid for me, and I cannot blame him. He has given me a choice, to end our letters, or to reveal your name and proceed as society demands. I have suspected your identity for some time. If I am wrong, then what I ask will be easy to refuse. If I am right, then we are bound by more than ink and must decide whether that bond is monstrous or honest. If you wish to end this, send no reply. I will keep your secret and burn our letters. If instead you are willing to step out of the shadow, come to Waverly Court tomorrow at 4 o'clock and ask to speak with my father. I will be in the garden. Yours, in fear and hope, M." The next day, as the village clock struck 4, Margaret sat on the bench in Waverly's small garden, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart had never beat so hard. Inside, she faintly heard the front knocker, the low rumble of her father's voice, another answering tone she knew at once. A few minutes later, the garden door opened. Thomas Elmsley stepped onto the path and walked toward her. "Miss Elmsley," he said quietly. "Mr. Elmsley." Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "So you are A." "Yes," he said simply, "I am A, and yet also Edward's brother." The words were like stones, unavoidable. "The man who was away at war when I lost my future." "Yes," he said again. "That too." They looked at one another in the soft, uncertain light. He seemed older than her memory of him, more lined, more contained, but with a warmth in his eyes she knew from ink and paper. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked at last. "Why hide behind an initial?" He drew a slow breath. "Because I thought you would never answer if you knew. Because I was ashamed that my family had failed you, and I did not know how to make it right. Because when I first wrote, it was to protect you from some unseen correspondent, and I became the very danger I feared. Because once you began to write back, I wanted more than I had any right to want." "And what is that?" she asked softly. your forgiveness, he said, your esteem, and God help me, your heart. The last word trembled in the air. You presume a great deal, Mr. Elmsley, she said, though she did not pull her gaze from his. I know. His answering smile was crooked, almost boyish. And yet I must be honest now, when I have been hiding for so long. I love you, Margaret. I loved you before I dared put a name to it. Your letters brought me back to life in ways nothing else has since the war. Her throat tightened. I thought, she said slowly, that my heart belonged only to Edward, that whatever I had to give died with him. The village decided I was finished. I believed them for a time. And then your letters came, and I found myself laughing alone in this very room, arguing with you in my head, waiting for the sound of the maid's footsteps. She swallowed. If you had been a stranger, I think I would have fallen in love very quickly, joyfully. But because you are who you are, I have resisted calling it that. And now? His voice was barely above a whisper. And now, she said, I am too old to pretend ignorance of my own feelings. I love you. It is not the same love I felt for Edward, but it does not need to be. Hearts are not ledgers to be balanced. They are inconvenient, abundant things. His eyes shone. For a moment he simply stood there, as if afraid that moving would shatter the moment. Your father has consented, he said, recovering himself. He was kinder than I deserve. He said love need not be rationed like sugar, that Edward would not wish you to be alone forever for his sake. Tears pricked her eyes. Papa is good, she whispered. He is, Thomas agreed. And he has given us permission to walk here, within sight of the house, like two ordinary people trying to decide if they can be happy together. And can we? She asked. I believe we can, he said. The village will talk. Some will call it improper. But if we stand together, openly, not skulking in shadows, I think their talk will exhaust itself. We will be dull to them eventually. She gave a choked laugh. I have always wished to be dull to the malicious, she said. It sounds very restful. They both smiled then, a small, shared smile that felt like the first step onto new ground. Chapter 4. A new chapter. They spoke for a long time in that little garden. Thomas told her of the day he saw the errand boy with a letter for Waverly, how anger and protectiveness had pushed him to write, how quickly protection had turned into longing. I feared you would hate me when you learned the truth, he finished. I would have deserved it. I do not hate you, Margaret said, though I was very inclined to for about 10 minutes last night. After that, I only felt tired of fear. I have been afraid of what the village thinks for too long. I would rather be happy and whispered about than safe and half alive. I will do everything I can, he said, to ensure the whispers fade. I will not ask you to erase Edward for anyone's comfort, including mine. I would not consent if you did, she replied. But I thank you. He hesitated, then extended his hand, palm upward on the bench between them. May I ask, he said quietly, whether you would allow me to court you openly, to come to Waverly Court by the front door, to sit properly with your father, to walk with you on Sundays where everyone can see. No more hiding behind initials and errand boys, though I should like very much to go on receiving your letters. She looked at his hand. It was a soldier's hand, strong, slightly scarred, surprisingly careful. Yes, she said, and placed her hand in his. You may. His fingers closed around hers in a warm, steady clasp. For a moment, they simply sat like that, looking at one another with the shy astonishment of two people who had crossed a great, invisible distance. Then I suppose, she added, you had better begin to sign yourself properly. He smiled. As you wish, Miss Elmsley. She hesitated. "When we are alone," she said almost shyly, "you may call me Margaret." His answering look was all the declaration she would ever need. "Then you must call me Thomas," he said, "especially when you think me wrong. I believe you will keep me honest." "Oh, I shall," she replied, laughter soft in her voice. "You may depend upon it." The village did talk. At first, Mrs. Havers called the match strange and not quite proper. Mrs. Pritchard murmured that grief should not be recycled. But when they observed Thomas's steady devotion, his obvious respect, the way he never seemed to forget Margaret's comfort at public gatherings, the tone slowly shifted. "If anyone deserves a bit of happiness," Mrs. Havers conceded at last, "it is Miss Elmsley, and he is very good to the children." Letters continued to travel between Ashwell Park and Waverly Court, but now they were carried in open daylight by the post, not smuggled by boys. Margaret and Thomas found that they liked writing to one another even when they saw each other every day. Ink allowed a different kind of intimacy. "Dearest Margaret, today I watched you argue with the vicar about the state of the church roof. You terrify him. I have never been so in love. Yours, Thomas. My dear Thomas. You exaggerate. The vicar was only moderately frightened. Besides, if we are to be married in that church, I insist that it not leak. Affectionately, Margaret." Their engagement was announced by the vicar in careful language about two hearts brought together by shared sorrow and new hope. Mrs. Elmsley wept, kissed Margaret's cheeks, and apologised for 6 years of silence. Margaret's father, who had feared for his daughter's loneliness, grew lighter in manner than she had seen him in years. On a clear September morning, Margaret stood in that very church, the roof sound above her, and took Thomas Elmsley's hand before family and neighbours. As they walked out into the sunlight, lavender and rose petals in the air, someone whispered, not unkindly, "The Spinster of Waverly Court no more." Margaret heard and smiled. "I do not mind," she murmured to Thomas. "Spinster was their word for me. Wife will be ours. And Margaret, simply Margaret, will be mine." "Then that is what I shall call you," he said, lifting her hand to his lips. "Every day." They passed Edward's stone in the churchyard. For a moment, both paused. Margaret squeezed Thomas's arm gently. "He would not begrudge us this," she said. "I know," Thomas replied, "but I am grateful you said it." They walked on, out of the shadow of old grief, into a future neither of them had expected to claim. At Waverly Court and Ashwell Park, bundles of old letters remained carefully tied with ribbon in drawers, pages lined with A and M, with all the cautious curiosity, wit and tenderness that had brought them to this day. Those letters were the first drafts of the life they would now write together, side by side, in daylight, with no need of veils or initials. And somewhere in the village, when people spoke of Margaret, they did so less as an object of pity, and more as a woman who had, in her own quiet, stubborn way, refused to accept that her story was over. For it was clear to everyone who saw them walking together across the fields between Waverly and Ashwell that the Spinster of Waverly Court had not been finished at all. She had simply been waiting for the right pen, the right hand, the right courage to begin a new chapter. The end. If you've enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and quiet courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear our next Regency romance on the Regency Gazette channel. Thank you for listening.